Okay, so in this video lecture, I want to pick up where I left off in the previous one, talking about emotions. In the previous lecture, we were talking about basically the definition of emotions. This slide was intended to illustrate how the left hemisphere is the hemisphere that reads faces and emotions. And then we were talking about the amygdala hijack and or the neurology, right, the neurobiology of emotions. And effectively what this slide does is just it's intended to illustrate how much of the brain, how complicated emotions are, and they're more than just our thoughts. That there's this biological and this neurological reaction to environmental stimulus. This is a really cool slide, partly because of the images, but also because it's about the role of culture plays in our emotional experiences. The image in particular, the dark colors and the red colors, the light and the the light and the red illustrate like warmth, and the blue and the dark illustrate cold. And if you can read really closely, if you can read some of those tiny prints, for instance, like this guy here in the middle, I think you can see my pointer. That's warmth. They all warm. He's happy. He's happiness. But the guy next to him, he's sad. Person down here, this blue person is depressed, and this person, this warm person, is love. So again, it's just the emphasizing that emotions are a biological response. The question is though, or the significance where we have some control over our emotions, is how we think about what's happening in the environment, our cognitive appraisal. If we think about something as bad or good, that will influence how our body reacts and how we act upon that physiological reaction. So there's also some cultural differences. For instance, collectivist cultures versus individualistic cultures, right, experience a different rate of certain kinds of emotions. Let me offer some examples. So you have a group of emotions that are regarded as socially engaging, and these are emotions that turn you towards other people. Things like sympathy and guilt. Ironically, guilt is considered a socially engaging emotion. When a person is feeling guilty or sympathy, they will reach out to someone, they will turn towards. When your mother makes you feel guilty about something, you probably react in a way towards her, in a positive way towards her, maybe to remedy that. I mean, ultimately, we don't, guilt is not a pleasant feeling, but it does turn us towards other people. Right. So cultures that want to promote you to turn towards others or want to promote the collective interest will encourage you to experience guilt, right? They may even make you feel guilty because guilt will turn you towards the group. Socially disengaging emotions, emotions that turn you away from the group, right? These are some are things like anger and pride. Pride is considered, I would argue, in our culture, we see pride as a good emotion, right? We should be proud. We tell each other routinely, I'm proud of you. Effectively, we are campaigning or we are advertising that I am feeling like I am better than someone else. Pride turns us away, it separates us from the group, right? Obviously, the same thing with anger and fear, whereas sympathy and guilt turns us towards. So, socially engaging, right? Another thing to consider is the relationship between our language and our emotional experience. And this is a concept that comes out of sociology too, but the question is, can I experience an emotion that I don't have a word for? And I'm just going to leave that question with you. You can decide, right? Um, for instance, one of my favorite television shows is Little House on the Prairie. And I always think about, do you suppose Carolyn Ingalls experienced an anxiety attack? That term was not part of the language, was not part of the culture. So could she have experienced something that she didn't have a word for? Sure, her body could have reacted to the environmental stimulus. She wouldn't have labeled it that. And because she wouldn't have labeled it an anxiety or a panic attack, she probably would have acted in accordance with whatever her time and her place would have labeled it. You know, like Victorian times, the women had vapors. Basically, they fainted, but we call it the vapors. And there are certain rules around, and that's kind of what the next concept is right here around display rules. Each culture has a different set of rules around how you are allowed to emote, how you are allowed to act. These are your display rules. In the sociology, we call this the socialization of emotions, but it's the same thing. It's the idea that certain people, that there are right places, right times, and right ways to, we say there are right ways to feel, but it's not really the feeling. There are rules about how we're allowed to act upon those feelings, right? There's really no rules about how you can feel. There's rules about how you're supposed to be, how you're supposed to act. So some of the obvious ones are gender differences, like, who gets to cry more, right? There's rules about that it's more acceptable for women to cry than it is for men to cry, even though that's changing, right? Public versus private expression. Your boss can yell at you, but you can't yell at your boss. You can go home and yell about your boss, or you can yell in the car about your boss to your boss, but not to your boss, right? So there's like hierarchical rules. There's things like, there's rules about touching and crying. And, I like to ask students, were you allowed to be angry at your parents? Your parents certainly didn't have any problem being angry at you, but many students say that they were not allowed to be angry at their parents, right? So, a teacher can be angry at their student, but the student needs to be very careful about how they express their anger towards their students. So you got these private and public. You have class differences. Wealthier people are more subdued in their emotional expression. So that's what we mean by display rules. There's rules about when you're feeling sad, how you're allowed to act, right? It's a great example that gets used in, these TV murder shows about when the police showed up and we were told her husband was dead. She didn't act, she acted inappropriately. That begs the question, who gets to decide what's an appropriate emotional reaction, right? But there are cultural expectations and cultural rules about emotional expression. And these become really problematic for people like my son, who's on the autism spectrum, right? Autistic people emote, they express differently. And when we are emoting inappropriately or outside the social norm, we get judged and evaluated, and people interpret our motivations and our behaviors and ourselves based on that. Okay, just a couple other items here. I'm at my 8-minute mark. This is simply a slide that is intended to illustrate a couple different theories. There's 3 of them. There's like the James Lang, the Cannon-Bard, and a couple other names. I would not ask you to ever describe one of these theories, but what I want you to understand is all of these theories, and the story goes is they were all basically described at a similar time by different people, is they all have those 3 pieces. They have this environmental stimulus, right? Which then this cognitive event gets interpreted, and then let's see, how does it go? So you have the stimulus, you have the biological response, and then you have the emotional expression. So the cognitive interpretation, the body reacts, and then how you emote, right? And so this one theory says that they happen in sequence. You have environment, the body responds, and then you say, oh, I'm afraid. This is how I'm supposed to act when I'm afraid. This theory says the body and the emotional expression are the same. They happen at the same time without any sort of cognitive delay. This one over here says, I have the stimulus, I have a biological reaction. I think, what is that biological reaction? Oh, it's fear. Oh, I'm supposed to be afraid, right? So they all have the same pieces. They just are slightly different in the events, in the sequence and the timing of them. But remember, for examination purposes, you must know those 3 events, those 3 elements: the cognitive, the way I think; the biological, the way my body feels, my heart rate, my blood pressure, my pupils, my skin sweat; and then how I act, right? Those three elements, cognitive, biological, and behavioral. Okay, the last couple slides are just some fun things that I've stuck in. Well, this one actually shows up on a quiz. Some of the things that do predict happiness and don't, you might be surprised. Money only predicts happiness to a certain level, and that level is somewhere around $75,000 to $80,000 a year. Basically, the point at which you have your basic needs met, and then so there's this really tight positive correlation: more money, more happiness, up until about $75,000, $80,000. Then money oh, I guess I should do it like this. Money can continue going up. You can get richer and richer and richer, but your happiness ain't going to go up with it. Maybe you'll get a little bit more happy, but it's not going to be the same positive, consistent correlation. So more money isn't necessarily going to make you happy. If you look through this list, what you'll see is one of the variables is connections with other people, right? So religiosity, which is certainly a socially engaging thing, marriage, family, those are socially engaging things. Those seem to be the things that make people more happy. Says attractiveness. I've read somewhere else that attractive people are more happy, but the explanation for that is that attractive people are treated better by other people. So they have more opportunities to socially engage. It's not attractiveness per se, it's the network that attractive people get because they're attractive. Okay. And then down here, these couple terms: affective forecasting is a fancy way of saying we are really bad at predicting what's going to make us happy and what's going to make us miserable. Basically, we think that if blah, blah, blah happens, my life is going to be wonderful. And that's a bunch of baloney. The same thing we think is that if this and this happens, oh, my life is going to be terrible. That's also a bunch of baloney. We overestimate, and I forget who it was. It might have been Susan. No, it wasn't. Somebody else. I think it's a guy named Gilbert, who he has a book called Stumbling on Happiness. And the way he explains it is we are projecting ourselves out into the future, and we can't anticipate everything that's going to happen in the future. So we think, Sarah, in December, right? We think of what your life will be 6 months from now, but we don't really know what other experiences we're going to have in 6 months from now. So we say, in 6 months from now, when I have a new car, my life will be better. But lots of different things can happen in 6 months. So we're just really bad at that. And we also get used to things very quickly. When we get a new cell phone, 6 months later, we want another new cell phone. That's what's referred to as hedonic adaptation, is that we adapt very quickly. We adapt both to good things and to crappy things. We just are resilient. We're a resilient species, but we want, and this is where capitalism works so well, is that they're always trying to sell us newer and better. We got the newest, it made us very happy. Oh my gosh, now there's another new one, right? You have to have that one too. And so we're always wanting more and more and more. It's kind of like we can never be happy. All right, and then just the last two slides, you can read those on, if you print off your packet. Strategies, connections with people, do things you enjoy. There's a tiny relationship between your brain neurology and depression and happiness. People who have, say, more serotonin and dopamine receptors, right, as opposed to people that don't. So part of our happiness is genetically influenced. And then I found this a few years ago too. It's the significance of laughter and how laughter is social, right? And that promotes socially engaging. And somewhere someone said that you can't tickle yourself, because tickling is kind of like this evolutionary leftover of the chase. That think about small children, they love to be chased by their parents, and that we interpret that as desirability, that when someone wants to chase us, to tickle us, that is a way that they want us, right? So does that make sense? I hope that makes some sense. But you see the little kids and they run up to you and they poke you and they want you to chase them, that makes them feel desired and wanted when somebody wants to chase them down and tickle them. Okay, I'm going to wrap up this chapter right here, and that's that.